can I start by introducing myself, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this seminar, which is part of the advisory board's activities for the day. My name is Dame Stephanie Shirley. My dameship comes for services to information technology, and one of those services was to co-fund the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm very proud of its progress, and I'm sure the standard today will be maintained for the future. Like most people, I've been to school, and so I think I know something about education. But in my lifetime, education has moved from this sort of didactic teaching to a much more conductive education. And we stopped thinking about pumping people full of information, because we can now get that in other ways, and we concentrate in teaching about skills. So it's particularly appropriate that this afternoon I'm able to introduce to you Andrew Pinder, whom I've known for many, many years from the IT industry. He's had a distinguished career in both the public and commercial sector. He was on the Prime Minister's e-envoy. He was the Prime Minister's e-envoy from 2000 to 2004, and that culminated in a well-deserved CBE. And before and after that, he worked as a consultant. He is a member of the Oxford Internet Institute Strategy Board, and I'm very grateful that he's able to address us all this afternoon. And his topic, or his title, is The Future of E-Learning. Please welcome Andrew Pinder.
Thanks, Steve. As Stephanie said, I've got a long, not necessarily a distinguished career, but a long career. I'm 59 years old. And I've worked at both the public sector and the private sector. Public sector as a civil servant for a long time, then out into industry, and then eventually as a consultant and a small-scale venture capitalist, and then back into the Cabinet Office, and now back doing international consultancy. The reason I'm really here today, though, is because I'm also, since January this year, chairman of a thing called Becta, which is a government agency. It's an agency which looks after the technology in the education system other than higher education, that is excluding universities, which have their own particular constitution. But my job is to run a Quango, a non-departmental public body, is the respectable description of it, funded by the Department for Education and Science, and my job is to go and make sure we have the right sort of technology in schools and in lifelong learning and in further education colleges. And I want to talk about that, but I want to talk about it from a particular perspective. And that's where our connection goes back a long way, and my previous career sort of gets relevant, because I come at this not as an educationalist. I've observed education at close hand. I've been subjected to it. I'm actually currently subjected to it at home because my wife is doing a PhD. But I'm involved, I'm an interested partner, but I'm not an educationalist. And therefore I'm here today to ask you for some help. Those people who here are interested in education or academics or have other interests in education, I want some feedback from you and some help from you in some of the questions that I'm facing right now, and I'd be interested in your input. That's why we want to try to make this a seminar rather than a speech. My previous background is relevant because I'm really a sort of projects guy, a doer of things, a business person. I run the information technology organisation and the operation organisation for the Prudential Insurance Company. I had 15,000 people working for me there. And I did a very similar job for Citibank for Europe, where I had 21,000 people around Europe running ops and technology for this very large American bank. So my job, my whole background is around running businesses or getting things done for businesses and building processes. And therefore I come to this current role as chairman, which is a very part-time role, with that perspective and that bias, rather than as an academic or as an educationalist. So let me just tell you a little bit about Becta and then start talking about some observations I've got to make, which I'd like you to challenge or cheer me on and say, yes, absolutely right on, or give me your points of view on or your input to. I was asked to become chairman of Becta in January this year. Becta is an organisation, as I said, of a few hundred people. It dictates a spend in education of about £1 billion a year in technology, and an investment, a sunk investment of several £1 billion. So it's a significant organisation in the sense that it could make a big impact. One of the reasons that I became chairman is because it's felt generally that technology has underperformed in education. If you look at the outputs of education and look at the outputs, compare that to the inputs of technology, the huge inputs of technology that this current government and indeed previous governments have made into education, it does not appear to have produced as much as it might have done. It hasn't produced a big return on investment. There are pockets where it has, some good examples where it has, but on the whole, probably a lot of it has been money that's been wasted or is sitting there wasting away, ready to be used more effectively. Now, why is that? What are the things? Why is this profession, or as I will continue to call it through this talk, this industry, this education industry, making inadequate use of the investment that's been made in technology? Was it the wrong investment, or is it just that people are unable to use the technology effectively? Let me now, so that's the thrust of where I'm going to go today. But let me just talk, first of all, about the possibilities around e-learning, the possibilities around using technology in learning. And again, I'm not talking about universities here. I'm talking about all other aspects of education, but specifically not universities. The technology has enormous potential. In most of the other industries that are around in the world, technology, one way or another, has made a fundamental difference to the way that things work. It's revolutionised the car industry, created a whole new industry, the information technology industry, my own industry, the financial sector. It's made radical changes over the years. Banking is a different thing now from how it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 20 years ago in each of those phases. So things have changed enormously in most other industries, but not very much in education. Now, that's not for lack of gizmos. There's a tremendous exhibition that's held in the UK every year at Olympia in the middle of January. It's called Becta, and this fills 2 halls of Olympia with nice, shiny new bits of kit, bits of technology, bits of software that look tremendous. It's one of those real, if you're interested at all in technology, it's a real good day out. You can have a wander around and see all these brightly coloured things, ranging from flashy little bits of kit for 3- and 4-year-olds in kindergarten, lovely little computers, and to teach them how to use a computer, through to some very sophisticated remote learning devices, some devices that will help people drive their own learning, take learning at their own pace. There's lots of stuff out there. And some of that stuff is being used very effectively in 1 or 2 little places. There are 1 or 2 teachers, more than 1 or 2 teachers. There are a few thousand teachers around the country who have really used technology in an innovative way in teaching geography. You'll find a great geography teacher in Peterborough doing some tremendously innovative things. There are lots of people around who are using these things innovatively. But why hasn't it apparently made a huge difference to educational output? Well, how do we know that it's not made a difference to educational output? Well, we've tried measuring it. We've found that there is a correlation with some schools who appear to have had, with control groups, who appear to be able to identify a lift in standards as a consequence of putting technology into their schools. Probably about 15% of the UK's 25,000 schools have made some effective use of technology that actually is making a difference to their outputs. Now, most schools have had about the same input of technology into them. For many years, about 5 years, technology spend in schools was ring-fenced, in that schools were given money for technology and they couldn't spend it on anything else. So we know that they had the money to spend on technology, and we know that they probably didn't spend it on something else. They did spend it on technology. And indeed, if you do what I would do and visit schools, you'll find plenty of technology around, including in the 85% of British schools that don't appear to have had any measurable impact from this technology. So why is that? What are the things that are causing this apparent lack of ability to use technology effectively to make a difference to learning outcomes? My proposition is that the education industry does not recognise that it's an industry. It doesn't organise itself as an industry. There are lots of people who can make clever use of technology. But as those of us who've worked in industry, or indeed those of us who have observed industry, and certainly Steve Shirley and the business she founded many years ago, a very successful business, had access to technology. Lots of businesses have access to technology. Education's got access to technology. The difference between being successful in a business or in a profession using technology is the organisation of that technology. And I think what seems to have happened is that if I look at my own career in, for example, in Citibank, a bank that had tremendous technological skills, it did some groundbreaking things, but it also spent a lot of money on stuff that it wasted. The difference between spending the money on stuff that it wasted was it was put into the hands of people who did not know how to organise it properly into a business model. And so my observation coming in from outside into the education business is that you've got a lot of technology out there in the hands of people who, on the whole, don't know how to organise it into a business model, a learning model. They don't seem to be able to say, here's how we change the way we do things around here to take best advantage of the things that are available to us, including technology. We've actually encouraged this tendency over the last few years. When I was the envoy, we managed to get a pile of money available, and Charles Clarke, who was then Education Secretary, grabbed hold of me and wanted some money to run with electronic whiteboards. We put electronic whiteboards into lots and lots of classrooms. Now, those of you who've seen electronic whiteboards know that they're really nice gizmos. They're good. They actually sort of help the process that a teacher goes through in doing their traditional job. Indeed, if you go to a classroom now, really the only difference now between now and 100 years ago is that the furniture is a little more comfortable, and it's a whiteboard, not a blackboard. The same process is still happening. It's 30 kids and a teacher relating, and the teacher's doing some stuff. And there's a bit of technology, if the teacher can make the technology work, that actually helps that process a little bit. It's still a cottage industry. Teaching is still one person and a few people. One person and a few people. Now, that's not how it works in the wider world. In the wider world, when there's a piece of technology and an output to be got, and technology can make a process, can make an improvement to that, a process is invented to actually get us there. And so one observation is that in the small percentage of British schools where things have changed at the institutional level. A head teacher or a group of people managing the school have decided that they're going to change the way they do things around here, and they'll organise things differently. And they've managed to carry all their colleagues with them in the way that a person organising a factory or organising an office process would do. They take everybody with them. In most parts of the education sector, however, that's not the case. There will be individual enthusiasms. It's very much a ground-up operation. There'll be some geeky teacher who will go down to PC World and find a nice bit of computer kit, or will turn up at Becta. They come in their thousands to Becta in this exhibition in January, and they'll write a little cheque for a little bit of kit that they're going to use in their classroom, and perhaps show it to some of their friends who are also teachers and say, isn't this neat? What's not happening is the industrialisation of education using technology. And what I want to engage in a debate with you about is, first of all, is that a relatively accurate observation? Does that make sense, or would you like to challenge that? And I'm very happy to challenge it. We've got some people here, I'm sure, who will have a go. But if it is a more or less accurate representation, what can we do about that? How do we change things around? How do we make things different in the education industry so that we actually produce the outputs that we want on the scale that we want and get a return from these several £billion worth of investment that have gone in and are continuing to go in every year. Before that happens, though, some observations about what might be different about education and the environment that education finds itself in compared to other industries. Now, first of all, it describes itself as a profession. Now, professions are funny things. Professions, one always wonders why people describe themselves as a profession. Now, of course, there are lots of definitions about why a profession is a profession and a job is a job. But often, again, an observation, what seems to happen is people who insist on calling themselves professionals are trying to maintain some sort of independence. They don't want to be organised. They pride themselves on their independence. They pride themselves on that they're an expert and nobody else really is. And so there's a sort of resistance to change in the education profession because as people push back to say, I'm a professional, I need to be given space to go and run my own thing. I'm not going to be organised in the way that other people might be organised. Let's talk about that proposition. The second issue, which sort of comes out of the first issue, is that the supply side of things is hopelessly disorganised as well. Again, in most other industries, those people who are responding to those industries and helping them modernise and move forward and change things have organised themselves. You find big groups of industry working with the car industry, with the financial services industry, actually producing goods and services for them in an organised way to make them more efficient. They have an intelligent customer pulling things through and the services are organised. The supply side in the education sector is extraordinarily fragmented. There are tens of thousands of real little garage operations producing software and bits of kit. And very, very few, in fact, no big firms, and only about half a dozen mid-sized firms responding in the UK industry and actually generally around the world. Now, part of that is a response to the very disparate buying power. Again, the buying power is largely in the hands of individuals in schools who spend small amounts of money who are almost hobbyists in the way that they have an enthusiasm and a passion about something. They are typically they'd be people who would have a real passion about open source, as if open source is any different to any other software. It's just the pricing structure of open source is just different, that's all. But they have a passion. It's a religion. It's a real belief. And again, they tend to have bits of belief about bits of technology that are going to change things. What they don't do, however, is organise things properly. So, the question I'd like to ask all of you is, how do we organise education to be much more effective, much more efficient, to use the investment that it's got, to change the way it does things, to become more disciplined about the way it organises itself, in some respects, to subsume the individual professionalism into the greater good of a larger institutional professionalism, to produce better organisations rather than vying to be just individually better teachers. Because as one looks at education around the world, it's quite clear if you go to a school that it's very rare to find an institution which is, as it were, the best in its locality. Sometimes it's good at some things, it's good at other things. There are schools that are good at particular subjects. But on the whole, it's institutions who produce education, with very few exceptions, rarely are excellent. There are excellent teachers. There are sometimes excellent heads, but rarely is there an excellent institution. And I would contend, and that's because the profession itself does not organise itself in a way to be excellent. As an institution, it organises itself into being excellent as an individual. Teachers like being stars. They like being in front of a classroom. They like relating to the kids. They have a passionate belief in it. But they not necessarily are people who are going to organise everybody else around them to produce a production line with the outputs that everyone agrees on and wants. So, I've got a gang of people here who are interested in education, one here on the right-hand side who desperately wants to speak. I'd like to engage in a dialogue about that, and it was meant to be a dialogue, and I've been challenging and a little rude about the educational profession. And it is not meant to be personal, it is really just an observation and a conclusion that one might draw. But I'd like to talk about why can't we make e-learning and the use of technology in education really work to produce massively greater outputs, as opposed to just having these little cottage industries. Bill.
We've asked 3 respondents to actually comment, but I don't know whether Ted, if your question is.
I'll keep it down. Ted Nelson of the OII. What I find astonishing is the way you ask the question: why hasn't technology improved things? To me, the question is, how could it possibly improve things? Because the educational system is driven backward from this great wind, which is the tests. The tests, the GCSE, the A-levels. It's all about that. And these tests are not central to, they're not simple, narrow, rifle shot things. They're broad, scattered examinations with a very broad and somewhat humanistic approach. And how to reduce that to a system of criteriality and teaching, this could be an enormous effort, but I think it's an R&D effort on an enormous scale.
Okay, let's hear it. I've asked 3 people, and they had no preparation. They had the questions were not given out in advance. But John Furlong, who's the head of the Department of Educational Studies here at Oxford University. Then Rebecca Einan, who's at the OII, a research fellow, and also teaches in the Department of Educational Studies. And Ellie Noem, who's head of the the Center for Teleinformation at Columbia University, wrote this famous article in Science, in 1996 or so, on a bleak future of university education. But anyway, so we'll get 3 comments, maybe a response from Andrew, and then we'll open it up to others. John, would you mind?
Yeah, let's get it over with. This is really, really unfair, I think. It really is. It's a situation that Rebecca and I were just saying, just a situation we absolutely hate most, where we don't know what's going to be said, and yet we're up there to perform. But there we are. I'm going to begin by adding to your questions, but making them a little bit more concrete, I think, to add into the why question. And it comes out of a number of colleagues here in the last month or so been working very hard on a new project proposal on adult learning, and it just kind of sharpens this for me, the thinking there. It builds on our research proposal. It builds on earlier work that I've been doing in that area, and I've done a couple of projects really looking at how we understand the 1/3 of people in the UK, the 1/3 of adults who engage in no formal education or training from the time they leave school at 16 throughout their whole adult lives. All right, and that really does sharpen this question very, very strongly. If we go back 10 years and the launch of the government's initiative on the Learning Society, there was huge aspirations that somehow ICTs in different forms would introduce any place, any time, any level learning that would actually fundamentally and profoundly crack that really, really challenging issue. I did another project which book came out earlier this year, where we actually had looked very, very carefully at large samples of adults and trying to see the extent to which their engagement with ICTs, as it was starting to penetrate their domestic lives, had had any impact at all on their engagement with lifelong learning. And if we, it's a large-scale survey, but with also detailed qualitative work, and the patterns that we got from that research show precisely the same patterns as before the ICT revolution. We had the same people on the same trajectories, and it had not had any impact in terms of their engagement in lifelong learning opportunities whatsoever. However, what we did see was some amazing uses of technologies in people's domestic lives in a whole very, very rich variety of sorts of ways. So clearly something is happening, but it's not actually happening in terms of bringing that experience into the educational system. That work also built on some other work, similar work I'd done with kids at home as well, looking at the sorts of things that they were doing at home and comparing that with the sort of things they experience they were having in school. And again, you've got this amazing mismatch with the kids having these wonderful, rich, engaged, screen-based lives, doing all sorts of very interesting things, often on precisely the same issues as they were being asked to do at school. And yet, when they moved that into school, it seemed to collapse. And that's a very good and concrete set of contexts, then, to ask the sort of questions that you're asking. And I think I think your question's right. I think you start completely from the wrong end of the scale in terms of finding an answer. The answer is not an industry. When you start to compare these two contexts, the domestic and the formal learning, what you start to understand is, and it's precisely the point that was being made over here, that the challenges imposed by engaging with ICTs in the context of learning are huge, and they're huge for institutionalized education. The nature of knowledge is profoundly changed in very, very important ways, and most particularly the ownership of knowledge. Whose knowledge is it? And bringing that into a formal, particularly school context, is immensely challenging. There are very, very great challenges about the nature of time and the ways in which you engage with technologies and how that is actually quite entirely incommensurate with what goes on in most school systems. And that really also relates to the ways in which you engage with these things. And also the nature of the learner. ICT work, if you start to look at ways in which people in the domestic context are using it in learning purposes, they're not functioning as individuals. They're functioning as part of family networks, networks in their community, online networks, a whole variety of sorts of rich ways which they're bringing as resources into their learning activity. Again, that's actually very, very incompatible with most of what goes on in formal learning systems. And finally, the point is, yes, that it raises huge challenges about the nature of assessment as well, both in terms of the sort of things one wants to assess, but also the nature of the ownership and the engagement of the learner in that assessment process. Now, these are massive challenges. What is interesting is the few hero teachers, and they are out there, and they're individual teachers, very often rather than whole institutions, who are finding ways to accommodate these very severe and fundamental challenges that there are in the introduction of ICT. And I think they deserve a lot more understanding and a lot more analysis to actually see the ways in which they're dealing with these very profound dilemmas and building them into their school learning situations. I mean, I think your questions about the industry are interesting, but for me, they're entirely secondary.
Bill, do you mind if I just respond both to Ted and John's point, first of all? Because actually, I think we're in danger of sort of violently agreeing. But I'd like to just sort of take it on a little bit before Ellie and before Rebecca come in. I mean, I do agree absolutely with Ted's point. We're not necessarily measuring the right things, and you know, there's a whole separate, as it were, debate about how do we measure things. Having said that, I think I'd like to talk about what John was just been talking about, because I don't necessarily think I am approaching it from completely the wrong direction. I do agree with you that the way in which technology is used in schools, even when it's trying to imitate what's happening at home, just doesn't work. Now, my proposition there would be, and that's because the school is organised the wrong way. But you have to take things at an institutional level rather than a classroom level in order to give these hero teachers, and I agree with you that they do exist, a bit more space to actually do things differently. I've been reconstituting the board of Becta, and I recently brought a new board member on who was formerly a head teacher 15, 20 years ago, and is now a director of education somewhere. And in the interview process, I was asking him what he would change about the way in which he ran his school now compared to 15, 20 years ago. And he said he would change everything. He would no longer be afraid of teaching children in large groups of 200 people and also allowing the individualized learning. The nature of a school, the whole institution, needs to be a lot more flexible, not just the building, especially not just the building, actually the way the thing operates. And actually, why end at the school? Because actually it doesn't end at the school. It ends up with one school and perhaps another school, with one school and perhaps home. There's a whole string of things, and it extends beyond school into lifelong learning. So I think actually we do agree, and I think I'm coming at it from a different direction. But the direction I'm coming at it says that no industry has reformed itself at the individual level. It's reformed itself at the institutional or larger level. And where we've got to go for in in reform in education using technology more effectively to produce the outputs, to make learning more personalised, to allow people to develop the skills that they're able to develop, a more varied approach to the way that people develop. You have to allow them space, and you can only allow them space by changing the institution. And you can only change the institution by changing the whole of the institution. You can't change the institution in bits. It doesn't come in convenient bits that you can actually change radically. And therefore, an industry or industrialised sort of approach that says, we're going to change the way we do things around here. We're going to use technology more to make things more individual, to make people learn and enable people to learn in a way which is more natural to them and they're more used to outside. You have to tackle the whole institution, which means you've got to stop looking at these people as a gang of professionals, all of them operating in front of a classroom with 30 kids or 25 kids. They've got to start operating as a whole institution, being more flexible about the way they operate. And I think we're saying similar things, but I'd be interested in a response later on when other people have had a chance.
Okay, well, my experience is in higher education, but I think the problems are quite similar, so I'm going to talk about those. I do agree, of course, that when we look at e-learning, we just see pockets of innovation across schools and across higher education. And I think that's basically because there are no institutional reasons or rewards for people to actually change their practice. The kinds of people who change their practice get a lot of personal benefits out of these things, enjoyment and pleasure out of seeing their students perform well. And until we start to see organisations where people are rewarded for changing their practice in terms of recognition, in terms of better pay and so on, then institution-wide change will never occur. And I think that to try and promote this kind of organisational change, we really must listen to the people who are already working on the ground, doing these kinds of things, but we also need support from the top as well. And it's a kind of dialogue between these two groups that will eventually enable organisational change, I think, and promote e-learning across schools. I think the Building Schools for the Future programme that many of you have probably already heard of is quite an interesting initiative where there is now significant billions and billions of pounds worth of investment in building new schools and making technology embedded within those schools. And these are the conversations that are taking place right now. What would this school look like? What spaces should there be? How many students could be taught in different learning spaces across the school? And I'll be interested to see the impact that this ongoing initiative has on change across the UK. But I think that my kind of last point really is that I think in e-learning we still don't know enough about, firstly, what works and why, and we really don't know enough about students. And I think we make lots of assumptions about students all the time about how they're going to be motivated and how they're going to be excited and how they're going to be interested by e-learning, but we really don't know exactly what they're going to be like or what they do until we do more research. So I'll just conclude with the need for more research.
Well, my own interest in this field is I've written about electronic education. I've actually then structured courses around it, trying to make them work from a distance to Switzerland, to Japan. So I got a bit of a hand-on experience, which is a bit of a kind of reality check on some of this. And I'm a trustee of an electronic university, the first university that actually was accredited in the United States that is fully e-based. So from those perspectives, what can I add to the informative and insightful talk that we've heard? In a way, it's important to understand that education consists out of several elements. And the two major ones, and I'm sure there are several others, are to convey information and skills. And secondly is the socialization, the mentoring, the peer group, that kind of aspect that in some ways is exemplified by us being here. And education has those two components, and probably at the higher education level there is more of the information and the skills relative to the K-12 type education, where there is much, perhaps more of a socialization function, a mentoring, the teacher as authority figure, the peer group socialization, etc. But it's a question of degrees. Now comes kind of at every institutional arrangement, schools, universities, is based on a certain technology that translates itself also into economics arrangements, and that creates institutions. Now comes a different technology, a new technology, and there are all these kind of expectations that things will change enormously. But remember, there have been past promises. This is not the first technological new technology, and there was always going to be, everything's changing. And people, like in a Rorschach test, read their hopes and fears and aspirations into the technology and say, things were bad, things are bad, but now we've got the internet. Okay? So I think in some ways we're setting us up for failure by expecting that all these things that we invest into the educational process, which are enormous, and in the United States practically everything is kind of read into education. That's why in the civil rights era and beyond, schools were the focus of the debate, and so on. Now, I think one observation is that, to answer Andrew's question, institutions have a real hard time to self-reform, and educational institutions are really bad in self-reform. It's really bad, and in a way they're not facing true crises. They can't go out of business, let's face it, and competition is kind of limited, although I think on the university level maybe there exists a bit more of it, and also they are run by the workers themselves, the professoriate, and in the case of higher education. And so therefore, it's kind of, can't really expect very much of internal reform. In some ways, reform has to come from the outside. The history of universities was based on an existing, on a technology that still underlies the university system. We can go back to Assyria and to Egypt, to Alexandria. Those were basically universities at that time, were libraries, and kind of even going back almost 3,000 years, kind of there was a large library, and the library was organized in rooms, and the rooms had kind of like history and music and astrology, astronomy, and kind of literature, poetry. And in those rooms, with those kind of books and scrolls, sat scholars. And in a way, think of it, this is kind of like departments. And they kind of basically are the same departments we have today, like science and mathematics and history and whatever, law. And so what the technology was that information was very scarce. And the reproduction of information was very scarce. So information was kind of saved in certain locations called libraries. And the scholars came to the information, used the information, added to the information, sat around, argued among themselves, were kind of jealous at each other, and whatever kind of things happened 3,000 years ago, which are still with us. And the students came to the scholars. From all over the world, they came in order to sit around the scholars and be instructed by them. And that's the system, in effect, that still exists today. Now comes an electronic technology, and it changes a lot of things, because now information is not scarce, and it's everywhere. And you can sit in Miami Beach, on the beach, and essentially be plugged into, if you're a professor, into your network of colleagues around the world, because the people next door are really kind of often irrelevant to your specialty. And the students, in effect, can plug in with each other, kind of the peer aspect, and they can also plug into, potentially at least, into courses that are provided. So the underlying technology is now changing, and the institutions in some ways will be affected by it. This will take kind of the way things are, kind of maybe 800 years, but kind of clearly those implications are there. And one of the reasons is economics. The traditional system that you described, the one teacher, 30 students, translated to the university. See, in schools, it's a little bit different because there's a certain custodial element to it. And what do we do with the 7-year-old kids? Send them to school, okay? So there's a bit of a kindergarten function in it. But in higher education, the kind of, well, maybe two, but it's kind of a bit more of a pull education rather than a push education. It's kind of go to school, it's good for you. And so, but one of the things clearly changing is the economics. That is kind of instead of that one teacher dealing with 30 kids, this is a very expensive proposition. Think about it. I mean, at an American university, if you divide the tuition by kind of the instruction minutes, you get some kind of on a per hour basis. It's just enormously expensive, and even here or in other European countries, if it's subsidized by the state, it doesn't make any difference. Somebody pays for it, and it's kind of quite expensive. And now comes the technology that makes it possible, just like film overcame the theater, which is expensive. You have the same thing. You have kind of star professors, great, I mean, in fact, it could be actors reading a script, right, who kind of give great lectures about kind of the literature of Greece. And it doesn't go just to 30 or 50 people. It goes to 30,000, 50,000 people who kind of log on asynchronously whenever that is necessary, whenever they study it. And so now comes the question, who is going to do that? Universities could do it, but they're kind of low-tech, and it turns out this is a difficult proposition. It's expensive. If anybody of you has anybody of you done an electronic course, kind of provided it, not taken it, I'm sure you will agree that it's actually much, much harder than the traditional way, which is kind of like, I walk into the class, I got a few notes there, there I go. Now, instead, I have to script it kind of quite closely, and the requirements to all kinds of bells and whistles increases exponentially, and it becomes actually quite expensive, just like a Hollywood movie is much more complicated than, say, a play in terms of production. Okay, to come towards the end, where am I? Yes, so the economics changes, and therefore the question is, can universities do it? I think not really. The providers of such an education are likely to be much more kind of educational publishers, kind of like the course becomes like a textbook that is kind of sold. And secondly, more generally commercially based universities that specialize in certain kind of popular programs such as MBAs and kind of software engineering, stuff like that. But universities still maintain a role. The role of the university is important as a credentialing agency. See, if kind of nobody wants to get a degree from essentially a mail order type institution, kind of like the corner of the street type university. Anybody can call himself, herself university and kind of start peddling degrees. So there has to be valuable, a degree has to have some kind of brand. And the traditional universities do have that brand and that credibility, as long as they're kind of protected and don't self-commercialize themselves. But it doesn't mean that the university or the schools have to produce their own courses anymore. It is more like that they decide to get a degree from Oxford, you need the following 19 courses. You can have them inside from a real person, or you can take them outside from a provider, from an electronic provider for those courses. And that can be a commercial provider, a non-commercial provider, whichever way you want to do it. So, to conclude, universities will undergo significant change through the education, through the technology, particularly in their function as information providers. That function can be done very well electronically. In their function as a peer group provider, I think they're also going to be significantly weakened by the kind of community or kind of base of the internet. In fact, one can imagine that a lot of education in the future will take place by students and kids teaching each other, or telling each other, read this, read that, instead of kind of going through the authority figure of a professor. So you'd have a certain kind of disintermediation here. in which the providers, the universities or the course providers, deal directly with the kids deal directly with each other. In the intermediate level, I'm not quite sure what they're going to do. I mean, obviously there's the custodial issue, but beyond that, it might be actually lead to a significant reduction of the mentoring teaching role of the teacher, of the professor. Now, how does that plays itself out in elementary or secondary education? I am not quite sure, not being an expert on the subject, but maybe Andrew can relate to that.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks, Rebecca. First of all, Rebecca's point, yes, of course, more research, and I wouldn't dare say anything else in this forum, but I also believe it, so long as it's relevant research. Let's get rid of the sort of research which is all about going around bayoneting the wounded and just relating what happened in the past. Let's start thinking about what's going to happen in the future and make research relevant and help deal some of these problems. Ellie's point was really an interesting point because it illustrated the fact that technology can genuinely change things. The technology can enable a whole pile of things to be different. But I deliberately, in the way I talked about this stuff, didn't want to talk about technology because technology is sort of, well, it's two things. It's sort of not really the point. The point really is the educational process, the learning process. But actually, in one sense, technology is completely the point because technology has been one of the things that's changed our society. And therefore, it's people, I think, certainly in Western society, people's expectations of what they're going to get out of society are coloured by a variety of things, part of which is technology. So your point, John, about the way people do things at home, that's changed because of technology. Children do things differently. I know that my daughter, she's now done her MA, moved on, but when she was doing her homework, she would multi-process, she would be listening to music, she'd be doing things she would do on the computer, and she'd be very effective academically. I would never have dreamt of doing that. The technology wouldn't have been able to. Technology wasn't there, and my mind was not adjusted to be able to cope with that technology if it had been there. And so I think people are different now to how they used to be. Society is different, expectations are different. And institutions are sometimes slow in responding to that. The area I've been working in for the last 4 or 5 years is in government, trying to make government more responsive to people, particularly in dealing with people over the internet, moving more towards personalisation, a few halting steps, to really responding to the increased consumerism demand, which is really all about egocentricity, people wanting things to be organised around themselves, rightly so. Education, your point as well, Ted, about people being able to move at their own pace and being developed as people, not as things that come in sections and uniform beings, is a sort of personalisation point as well. It seems to me that technology can make a huge difference around personalising the learning experience and getting the best out of learning for people, getting the best out of people in their learning. We need to organise ourselves for that. Organising ourselves is very difficult in an environment that doesn't recognise that it is actually an organised institution. It puts limits on allowing itself to organise itself differently because it has rigidities built into it. Schools are rigid things. They are not dynamic things. They don't have the pressures. They've had very few pressures. They don't respond well to consumer-type pressures and the pressures of people. And we have to try and change that. Now, Ellie's point made a point about external pressures can change things. And there are a variety of external pressures, external influences that can change things. There's a consumer demand. Schools are inflexible in responding to consumer demand. Perhaps increased, quotes, competition between schools is a very brutal way of doing some of that, and I'm not particularly in favour of it, but I think that it is sort of a brutal way of making people respond. In other industries, the supply side has been able to help. I think there are opportunities for organising the supply side to help change the educational institutions and the way education is offered. But we need to organise that differently. There's sort of a market failure there at the moment, and one of the things with my Becta hat on I want to try to do is intervene to try to create a more organised supply side to create a greater sense of how things might be different, rather than just a lot of little garage industries offering things which people may or may not take up. And I think academia perhaps can help us in helping organise how that supply side should look and the sorts of things it should be offering, so we can actually add an extra influence onto these institutions to get them to be different. So, for me, just summing up my little bit anyway, I think that there's a huge opportunity for change in education. Technology is partly the cause of the need for change because it's changed society. It's also part of the answer. It's not the complete answer. And technology, I've always found, has never led anything in an industry. It's always had to follow what is happening in that industry. But technology can help shape an industry. And I think that we need to start thinking more about how we can use technology to help education do what it would do if it knew what it needed to do. And the things that you were saying are really about getting the industry to understand what it needs to do. And the technology can come along behind it and help it happen. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Stuart Lee, Director of the University Computing Services, but occasionally I run the e-learning group for the university. Okay, I'll put you back to your previous job. I think it's unfair to sort of put the blame on universities or schools and leave the government out of this. Since 1979, the governments have successfully destroyed any reason or incentive to be innovative in your teaching in schools and universities. If you're in a school and you've waded through your inset days and you've marked all your papers, etc., and then you even have this half an hour in the evening to consider being innovative, your headmaster will come down and tell you, don't you dare. Your role is to get those students to pass the GCSEs and the AS levels, and you will wade through the textbook, and that is it, because we've got a league table to contend with. And if you're in higher education, you can forget doing anything innovative in teaching for the next 2 years, because we got the RAE in 2008. So to say that we're an industry or a firm in some sort of competition which we can dictate is slightly naive. I mean, we now have to dance to the tune, certainly this university, many other universities, to the RAE, and any teacher or lecturer worth their salt will be looking at their publication record over the next 2 years, and it's a real shame for the undergraduates who are here. The ones who are here in 2009 might have a chance, but the ones over the next 2 years, we're focusing all our attention on getting 5 stars. And in schools, they're focusing all their attention on matching the league tables and getting students certain grades in GCSEs and AS levels. And they just don't have the opportunity or the incentive, as Rebecca said, to innovate.
Can I try and respond to that? Because I don't want to get into a university debate, because I've got a lot of sympathy with you around the university piece. I don't have very much sympathy around the schools piece. Now, it's not because I disagree with the point that you were making, and particularly Ted was making at the beginning, which is we're probably measuring the wrong things. We need to be measuring different things, or perhaps calculating output differently. That's not my point. My point is, whatever it is we're trying to do, we're not doing it effectively. So we might be aiming to produce the wrong outputs, but even in producing those wrong outputs, we're not managing the process of getting people to that output effectively. And I think technology can make a difference. And my point is, it's the underlying process that's one of the issues, and the issue I'm trying to address. I'll leave it to you guys to start working out whether the output measures are the right output measures. But I'm absolutely sure that whatever we're producing it ineffectively and inefficiently. Now, it may well be that because we think we're measuring the wrong things, you're pleased about that, but that's a negative way of dealing with it, I think. Just because we're trying to produce the wrong things doesn't mean to say we're going to screw up the educational process in producing the wrong things.
John Dixon, carrying on with your business analogy, I wanted to say something similar to what our previous speaker has said. If education, let's imagine it was organised as a business, then one of the fundamental business processes which all business have to go through and to survive is product research and development. And in the education industry, then the board of governors, if you like, sorry, not the board of governors, the board of directors, the government are actually laying down by fiat what the products should be produced. And so that's a recipe for disaster And as somebody else said, the education industry can live with that because the government won't allow them to go down the tubes. And the second thing is, building on your project management analogy, supposing education were an industry and the industry decided that one of the greatest things they could do in order to use technology to further the aims of their industry would be to build the national grid for learning. Now, if I were project manager of that, I wouldn't have gone about it in any way, shape or form the way this government has done. It's a classic example of the absolute failure of project management and project development in the public sector. And it's no good blaming the education service for that. And I think that the greatest thing that you might be able to do is to get that view across into the government and allow the professionals to do the system development.
The point I'm trying to get across is I absolutely feel that we should leave it to the educationalists, to the experts, to the professionals to think about what the outputs should be. My instinct are that we're measuring the wrong outputs. I agree with, as it were, the progressives in education who say that. So this is not me saying people are not thinking in education and we shouldn't leave some things completely in the hands of the educationalists. And the measurement of those outputs absolutely have to leave there as well. My only point is that whatever those outputs are going to be, I think that there is a role for organising the way we get to those outputs better, which involves less rigidity in the system and more thinking about how technology can be more creatively used at an institutional level and a system level, rather than at an individual classroom level. Tackling the inefficiency of the system is not well done individual by individual. It's better done at a larger group level. That's my point. At the moment, we have a whole pile of people that John described as heroes, educational heroes, who are trying to produce the right outputs in a system which doesn't allow them flexibility to do that effectively. Sometimes they're using technology as ably as they possibly can, given the constraints that they're in. But they're stopped from doing that effectively, and the institution as a whole doesn't benefit, the system as a whole doesn't benefit as much as it might, because of the rigidities within it. So my underlying thing is reform of the educational system has to be at the institutional level, not at the underlying level. I grant you all the other points you've been making about we're doing the wrong things at the output. I don't want particularly to get into that debate because I, as an amateur, instinctively agree with you about it. But I am an expert at the how you produce outputs piece, the process piece, and my expert opinion there is that this particular profession, this industry, is less effective at that than it might be because it's not tackling it at a large enough scale level.
My name's Tony Hart. I'm a director of a company called Handheld Learning. And the last 2 days of last week, Thursday and Friday, we ran a conference called Handheld Learning 2006 in the QE2 Conference Centre. What we did is we brought together 500 plus educationalists, mainly across the secondary school area, but also higher and further education, and a number of technology companies, Microsoft, Apple, Sony, Nokia, a number of people both from the gaming, mobile phone, and the technology space. Cisco was there as well, to try to bring together these two communities and have a dialogue. This is the second conference we've run, and the interesting thing that came out of this, the conclusions were, there were kind of a number of different conclusions, but the main thing was that the good part of the conference was concentrating on the learning. The technology, I agree with you wholeheartedly, the technology was all about enabling a new way of teaching, a new way of learning. And the issues then switched around to how do you change the role of the teacher, the educationalist? How do you change them from being a gatekeeper or an imparter of knowledge to a facilitator to enable the students to be able to use that technology to go find their own ways of learning stuff? And I think that's the real challenge. ultimately, and again coming back to your thing about heroes, the problem that we have, I think, in education in this country is, and it's the same with any technology adoption curve, how do you go from those geeks, those innovators, and how do you get them to the mass market? And how do you bridge that gap? In technology, it's all about crossing the chasm from Geoffrey Moore, but that's coming back to the technology side. But that's the issue of how do we move that forward, even though, and I agree again, we're not necessarily measuring the right things, and there was all sorts of debate about that at the conference, but those are the sorts of things that we're challenged to do.
I can remember Alan Kay speaking decades ago about the fact that what you want to do is find the heroes, the pioneers who have figured out how to use technology in the classroom, and follow them, track them, find out what they are going to do in order to affect institutional change. So we've been trying to do that for decades, but I guess it supports your argument. I mean, we've been trying to look at pioneers and yet not being able to follow any path suggested by them.
I wonder whether we're looking at the wrong pioneers. I think, the reason why I say that is because I think actually what we need are two lots of pioneers here. You obviously need the pioneers, the heroes, the people who are using technology really innovatively with groups of children to help them learn in a way which works for the children. And absolutely we should follow those people, and we'll learn a lot about the one-to-one and one-to-two and group and networking educational process, the learning process. But we also need some more pioneers, and these are the ones who I think are in really quite short supply in the education systems, who are the pioneers around the organisation. And how do you organise those people so that the heroes' skills get transmitted around lots of other people, and on top of that, you get something which is some of the parts being greater. Sorry, the parts being being greater than the whole, the wrong way around, the whole being greater than the sum of the parts, simply by organising the institution in a way to maximise new ways of doing things, not just by one teacher or by lots of teachers and acting individually, but by the institution itself changing the way it's doing something to leverage all that.
Now that Andrew has refined or repeated his argument, I now understand why I disagree with it, which is, you see, in some ways, it's kind of not radical enough, to my taste. That is, it basically says there was a blackboard and then there's a whiteboard, and now we're going to have a screen, and let's just make it more productive and more useful, and let's just make sure that we kind of think it through. But in a way, I think it's a very fundamentally, it's a top-down approach in which somehow, somewhere in some kind of government or intermediate levels, people say, how do we make this process more productive for our customers, the students and their parents? But I think that in a way the technology is going to, not necessarily tomorrow, but just kind of ride over this, because it will make it possible to overcome the existing public school system. So we basically right now have a school system that is organized geographically, and then kids from different backgrounds and so on kind of come together, they get taught, and then they kind of go home. But in a way, societies, United States certainly, and others increasingly, are becoming much more diverse than this public school model. And you can well imagine that now, electronically, a private system becomes much more feasible because it's not as expensive, and you can aggregate kind of minority, kind of ideological. So you can have homeschooling is already becoming a big thing in America. So you can have electronic homeschooling in which you partake in, say, evangelical education or Islamist education or peer-to-peer wiki-type education or left-wing education or right-wing education. And this kind of notion of the public school as a common denominator gives way to consumer choice model in which people choose for their children the education that they want the children to have. And the only thing that would prevent that is, in a way, kind of to not recognize the credentials of those other schools or to force students to take public school curriculum. But once you have those legal constraints give way, there's no particular reason why that existing system would survive for a minute.
But aren't there all sorts of dangers around all that, around what that means for our society, given that education is partly about perpetuating the values of a society. If you have this diversity going on, doesn't that fundamentally change things? And I would feel uncomfortable about that.
Ken Kahn at OUCS. I got two questions. One of which is, I'm always hearing about experimental and innovative schools where an entire school is acting very much like the kind of heroes we're talking about, and they have maybe the students do very long-term projects and the teachers are acting as facilitators and they're mixing up grades and having many of the things you talked about. You hear about that sometimes at the level of a school experimenting in this way, and from the outset it looks like it's successful, but somehow it doesn't get copied. And the other question I had is, you talked about the business model and then about professionals, but when you said professionals, I started thinking about what little I know about the medical profession, because it seems as if healthcare is very different than it was 20 or 50 years ago, but I'm not sure that the relationship with your primary care physician is very different. It's still a kind of one-to-one cottage kind of relationship. So somehow I'm trying to understand if possibly the medical profession is a better model than the car industry or something, is how technology might actually make a big impact and yet leave certain things that are working well alone.
I think there are some, these guys here will know more about individual schools than I do. There are certainly some schools that seem to be using technology more effectively than other schools, though whether they're using it as fully effectively as they might do. Thomas Telford, I guess, up in Shropshire is often mentioned, but the specialist school trusts have a number of different sorts of models, different sorts of schools that they would put forward. I think that what they're not doing, though, are tackling the more fundamental things around the whole way that education, that learning works, which we've been talking about here to some extent. On your point about the health side of things, in a sense, what's happening on health, in the UK and in one or two parts of the US, well, in the Veterans Administration in the US, the Kruger type approach on the healthcare side, they are moving more towards using technology much more, partly to disintermediate the individual physicians to save costs. So in the UK, we're computerizing our health records, making them more widely available. So you don't have the individual physician acting as a gatekeeper so much. In the US, they're doing it for a different reason. They're trying to make blood tests and X-rays more widely available, simply so individual physicians, every time they see you, don't repeat the same tests and push costs up. So I think technology is changing that industry, but interestingly, it is moving it more towards being focused around the patient rather than, as in the UK, the healthcare industry was always focused around the GP, the general practitioner. In education is focused around the individual teacher right now. And I suspect that it ought not to be. It ought to be focused around the learner, and we need to be thinking about different institutional models to make it more like that.
My name's Ian Yorston. I'm from Radley College, where I'm head of digital strategy. Radley College is what those of us in England would call a public school, which for the Americans in the audience is what you guys would call a private school. And really the message I want to get across is I think you're targeting the wrong market. I think you're utterly wasting your time on the state sector because, as you can hear from the room, everybody is telling you there are massive, massive constraints on the state sector which will be very, very difficult to break. Whereas if you go into the private sector, you've only got to convince one board of governors. You've only got to convince a couple of heads and a couple of teachers, and we've got the resources, we've got the backing, and if your case is right, we'll take it and run with it. And we will produce the better results that you're offering, and we'll produce them at lower cost, which will have an immediate impact on our bottom line, and therefore your thesis will be very swiftly proved. Since we have a government who've repeatedly said they're rather in favour of private education, they just like to put the word state across the top of it. We have a Prime Minister, excuse the Freudian slip, we have a Prime Minister who is privately educated. You know, this is a government that is trying to take what we do rather well, which is innovation. And just about every innovation in the UK education sector over the last 200 years has come from the private sector. So why are you trying to do it differently this time? The private sector is the solution to your problem. We can prove your thesis very, very fast indeed.
I think you can't run away from some of the things that you've been saying, Andrew, and just simply say you're going to stay with avoid the content, avoid the assessment. It seems to me that you simply can't do that. I'm interested in exploring, which are by the two other commentators said they'll talk about higher education, but they thought it ought to work in schools. I actually think that profoundly doesn't work, that analogy. And the reason it doesn't work is that at the moment, with the difference between higher education and schools, is that we position the learner in relation to knowledge in a quite different sort of way. The point about higher education, of effective higher education, in the Newman tradition, is to position the person as a knower, as a critique, as an engager in knowledge on their own terms. That's the whole point about what higher education is. And in principle, then, a way of working through technology that allows learners to do that at its very core, that's what it's about. It ought to have a very, very strong running using ICTs in the context of higher education. But to say that ought in principle to work effectively because it puts the learner at the heart of what is going on, it shows the complexity of that when one takes that message into schools. And it seems to me that therefore the radicalness of really using ICTs inside schools is much more profound than than you currently want to admit. It raises questions about content, about whose content it is, about the role of the learner themselves in defining that content. And it's very, very uncomfortable. And of course, once you do that, once you start to engage with that seriously, then huge questions about assessment also start to follow on very, very quickly. And I noticed you didn't like to get engaged with the debate comment we had from just over here saying, and the whole thing will unravel and go entirely private and evangelical schools and whatever. But it seems to me that that's the dilemma. When one's working in a state school system and a mass school system, those are the dilemmas that the educational system has to grapple with and produce a compromise, and those compromises change over different historical times. But there are those tensions between wanting to control knowledge and having control forms of assessment and control the ways in which teaching and learning processes happen. And the thing about ICTs is that they're potentially disruptive to all of those things in very, very radical ways. And it's a very difficult force to manage. Higher education, though, should be able to get its act together.
Let me just try and nail the slur on my character about not engaging with Ellie there. Actually, I can see where Ellie's coming from, and I can see that trend and the disintermediation that may be happening. And I've got some friends in California who are educating their child at home and seeing the resources that's available to this, and that scares the hell out of me. And it scares the hell out of me because I think education is actually about more than just learning about geography and history. It's about a cultural thing. It's about developing individuals, but also individuals as part of a society. And therefore, whilst I can see the logic of Ellie's position, and I can see it happening, it worries me that it might happen for the reason I've just expressed. On your point, which says that there are more fundamental questions to be asked, yes, I think you're right. My job is to try to stimulate a debate, both here, but more particularly in the educational sector. And I think I'm biting off a pretty big chunk already by saying I think the institutions have got it wrong in the way they're organising things, and they need to be more organised. I completely sympathise with the other things you've been saying, which says there's much more radical stuff to be done. I'm leaving that to the experts, people like you, and other people. The two things are intermingled, I understand that.
20 years of being driven by technological answers in this field, right, which have ended up not being very productive. I understand what you're saying, and there's clearly a point to it, but whereas you're quite happy to say the technology is in a sense peripheral to teaching and learning, I agree with that, but I also think before you can do the organisational questions, you've got to ask the hard teaching and learning questions first, and there's a danger that we're still not asking those in the agenda that you've given us.
I think that's fair, and it's not intentional, but I think it's a fair point, and I absolutely accept the point. I think that it's, in a sense, I'm not sure that the institutions, the education system, and I would include the Department of Education, are themselves asking those questions properly. So I'm coming at it from a particular angle. I was upfront about the way I was coming at it from my own background and the questions I was asking. I think the questions I was asking are legitimate questions. That you're making the point that there are prior questions, and I agree with that too. I think there are improvements to be made given our existing outputs. I absolutely agree with you, and I would love to engage in a dialogue, or institutionally engage in a dialogue with how we can help from a technology standpoint, because that's where our Constitution says we've got to be, in engaging in that much more fundamental conversation that you've just been having, because I'd love to get involved in that. I think it's important. Where I think we're all violently agreeing is the education system at the moment doesn't work, and it's getting rapidly out of date. It needs to be changed radically. The issue is we need to come at it from a whole pile of different angles, and we can argue all day about in what order, but it's got to be changed. And right now, when I go out to the education profession, the people in schools and in colleges, there is not that recognition in the vast majority of people out there.
Can I wedge a question in, which would be I guess to all the respondents and everyone, I'm feeling like the students are getting relatively undifferentiated. I don't think that it's left-right students, but it's the very intelligent, less able students. I mean, isn't the right model of teaching actually have to be geared to the capacity of students? I mean, I reminded Seymour Papert's Mindstorms and Logo. It's like Logo really worked for the very bright MIT kids with 3 teachers hanging around them working with the programming. But for the average kid, in the average, Logo only went so far. And it just, really, the promise wasn't there. And I'm worried that, again, we've got a model of kids sitting around on the internet, getting the information they need, directing themselves. And maybe for the very brightest kids, that with a lot of socialization. So the mix of socialization versus content, the mix of mentor versus peer-driven, it's got to be very, very geared to the quality of not the quality, but the particular capacity of particular students. And I guess that's how they reorganize.
But that's sort of Ellie's point around higher education. It's self-directed, and that's the nature of higher education. It is. I agree with John here about it's fundamentally different at the school level. It's more difficult at the school level. And it's the whole point of this conversation has been it shouldn't be about being driven by the very bright kids. It's about trying to get education more personalised, to develop the aspects of people's character that they're able to develop properly and helping them develop those. So it's going at people's academic pace, it's going at their social development skills pace, it's trying to personalise the whole learning experience that we're interested in. I think we're interested in. I think technology's got a role to play in that, but much more fundamentally, as I've said half a dozen times, I think the whole system has got to start recognising that and changing that. Now, John's asking even more fundamental questions than that, and more articulately. But so I think you're absolutely right, but I think we moved on from there.
Chris Davis from Educational Studies here. I just wonder whether it helps me sometimes at any rate, to sort of try and break down what we're talking about when we talk about technology in schools, because I can immediately think of at least 3 different aspects to it. I mean, one, the extent to which we're moving towards that more now, sort of managing the students' learning career, learning lives, and that could be for good or awful, and I can't quite tell. I also think that probably teenagers are quite good at unmanaging that, but at any rate, that's one set of things. Then there is teaching and using technology to make teaching more interesting or enjoyable, and that's fine, because teachers have always done that in one way or another, use whatever's around them to make what they're doing when they're presenting and making ideas available. That's fine, but surely the most important to me is the newness that we're talking about, which is teachers and students working together to make the learning experience and to learn from each other. And I quite agree with that notion of thinking of the different levels at which that's going on, to help people think about learning in very different ways. And there they have to abandon some of the endless sort of drive to catch the train to the next stop. Otherwise you've missed it and you've missed the next key stage and all of that. That seems to me the one that we really would see a change in, because the others just and they're often all mixed together into a single thing. Like they're very, very different. The actual trying to deploy those technologies and the teachers and students to meet together to see how they make a different kind of learning experience, which some students are already working on, others aren't. But that time has got to be taken to do that actively and consciously in the classroom.
Kaz Librowski from Oxford Computer Consultants, but my question is an amateur one. When you were at Prudential and Citibank, you presumably had a large training budget to send your thousands of people on. And so there's a not insignificant industry already of training companies. And I was just wondering whether, because these are unconstrained, I mean, everybody here has been complaining about the constraints they're under. If there was some training company that was fantastically well organised, delivered wonderful value for money, got people trained to exactly the level you wanted them to be trained to, you would put business their way, and all the other people in your position would as well. So don't we just have to find a good training company, find their organisational model, copy it, and we're done, and we can go home? I mean, I was just wondering, why can't we learn from that? I mean, it seems that all the complaints that were made about constraints and so forth do not operate in that market.
But, I mean, first of all, I don't think I'd want to put people through what I put people through when I was at the Prudential. Knowing what I know now, or indeed probably not knowing what I knew then. I think that I mean, I understand the question is in one sense facetious. I think there's sort of a point here, which is actually the best learning that seems to happen in the training, in the work environment, in the way that I used it in Citibank in particular in Ireland, was much more around personalised self-learning, taking people at their own pace. And some quite sophisticated stuff that helped people learn at their own pace and learn the things that they were interested in and needed to learn. So I suppose that reinforces the point that the rare occasions when you see it do well, when you see the learning of a particular subject, a particular set of skills, a particular set of routines, which is what often you're trying to do in the industrial sector, that particular piece of learning occasionally is done well, but it's always done well by making itself in small chunks at people's own pace, and that's a piece I'd learn from that. I don't think I would hire to operate in an educational system any training company that I've come across in a fairly long career.
Well, could I thank Andrew for asking such fundamental questions, the respondents for really not knowing that they were going to be on the spot, but doing a great job, and for all the questions. This is a really interesting discussion. Appreciate all of you coming.
First of all, thank you for listening to me and for listening to my ramblings, and also thank you for actually the debate, because I have learned a lot, and it's really, this is really heartfelt. It has actually moved my thinking on quite a long way, and it's taught me some better questions to ask and some different questions to ask, and I appreciate that, because it has made a difference. And so I'll be talking to some of you again, I know now, and I want to learn from you. It's been very helpful to me, so thank you very much for the input.